Looking at Lincoln now, at the approach of the 150th anniversary of the outbreak of the Civil War, historians and others are apt to see him as greatness personified, one of the greatest military strategists, prose stylists, moral philosophers, and political theorists that the United States has ever produced, and perhaps the very greatest of all of these things. Some of these judgments about Lincoln are plainly overstatements about an indubitably great president, the greatest, I think, thus far in American history. Other judgments are more faith-based than they are fact-based. But just as striking as the celebrations and the celebratory tone has been, I think, the failure to recognize, let alone to honor, Lincoln's skills as a politician, which was, after all, his chief occupation. None of Lincoln's many other attributes would have mattered much if he had not been a dexterous and at times cagey politician. Had he not won the presidency in 1860, which was a supremely political achievement, he would be remembered as a footnote in history. The history not of the United States, but the history of the state of Illinois. Lincoln, the one-term congressman who ran an interesting but unsuccessful campaign against Senator Stephen A. Douglas in 1858. Had Lincoln failed to gain re-election as president in 1864, he would be remembered as one of the very worst presidents in American history, perhaps the very worst, who allowed the country to drift into civil war, presided over a corrupt administration, failed to defeat the Confederacy, and after 4 long, blood-soaked years, was rejected by the voters and sent back to Springfield in ignominy. Lincoln could have been a politician without being a statesman, but he could not have been a statesman had he not been also an excellent politician. Or, as the great Lincoln scholar David Herbert Donald once put it in an essay which I've actually drawn on quite heavily for this lecture, quote, Lincoln's opportunities for statesmanship were made possible by his accomplishments as a politician. For his entire public life, Lincoln was a tough and loyal partisan, an astute deal-maker, a party machine leader whose attacks on the stump could be every bit as personal and cutting as any we hear today. Lincoln always valued pragmatism over idealism, although he never gave up on his ideals, the practicable over the absolute, in line with what is the politician's very first rule, rule number 1, which is that there can be no good government without good politics. Lincoln saw no shame in the practice of democratic politics. He experienced no priggish discomfort about what it takes to get things done. For him, politics, ordinary, grimy, unelevating politics, was itself a good and an instrument for good. Lincoln knew who he was. He knew that his colleagues knew who he was. He would never renounce who he was, even when he was elected president amid the greatest crisis the nation had ever known, and would know to our own time. During his early, supremely taxing weeks as president, as the secession crisis came to focus on Charleston Harbor and Fort Sumter, Lincoln was politic enough to appear not the politician, but the national statesman, who would not personalize the conflict or say or do anything in malice. But in reality, Lincoln never ceased to be a politician, which his contemporaries fully recognized, often to their dismay. Even in the best of times, if they are to be successful, presidents must appeal to those who oppose them and carve out some sort of modus vivendi so that a majority of the nation, at least, is behind it. In the best of times, presidents must compromise, presidents must persuade. This requires abandoning moral absolutes, which is not the same thing as abandoning morality, and more than not, it requires resorting to misdirection, backroom dealing, unsentimental wire pulling, and all of the unpretty arts of democratic politics. That's in the best of times. Lincoln was president not in the best of times, but in the very worst of times. Not only did he have to command the Union military effort to defeat the Confederacy and preserve the Constitution, he also had to contend with, inside the loyal northern states, fractious Democrats and Copperheads, rival Republicans, squabbling, self-infatuated generals, a largely hostile press, and a northern population that by the summer of 1864 had grown so weary of military stalemate and mountain casualties that Lincoln was certain he would not win re-election. Yet he persevered. Lincoln's success, so I would argue, stemmed from more prosaic and even devious acts, which were sometimes in keeping with his basic temperament. I'm saying this, I should say with great respect, not as a criticism. Like many great leaders, Lincoln had a secretive nature, which he took with him into the White House. As a result, few of those around him, ally or rival, knew exactly what was on his mind until he was ready to tell them, at his own pleasure and to his own advantage. At once to offset and augment the advantages of his secrecy, Lincoln strategically deployed something else, his sense of humor. Andrew Jackson had used contrived displays of his renowned vengeful fury to keep his antagonists and even his friends off balance. Lincoln used jokes. More sensitive matters required greater finesse. Of course, Abraham Lincoln, skillful as he was, could not have secured the political advantage he needed to win the Civil War, one person or one delegation at a time. Especially in winning over Congress and shoring up support within his own party, he had to be an effective party leader as well as an effective president. And this meant handling patronage, at which Lincoln, after his long experience in the practical politics of Illinois, proved a master. The administration, Lincoln wrote up unapologetically, even proudly in 1862, distributed to its party friends, quote, as nearly all the civil patronage as any administration ever did. The statesman was also a spoilsman. Lincoln also took great care about which individuals received these jobs, listening attentively to state party bosses while also attending to his personal friends. The result was time-consuming but ultimately paid great dividends. Lincoln was also shrewd about the appointments of those in closest proximity to him. In case of his Treasury Secretary, Salmon P. Chase, is illustrative. Lincoln used other appointments to remove difficult persons from the everyday scene of action. The Bennett intrigue was just a wrinkle in Lincoln's maneuvering in 1864. Buoyed by Sherman's victory in Atlanta in early September, he saw that the results in several Northwestern states were bound to be close. So he wrote to Sherman, telling him anything he could do to allow his soldiers to go home to vote during the election would be, quote, greatly in point, unquote. Lincoln added that, quote, this is in no sense an order. But Sherman couldn't take the hint. This is the nitty-gritty of politics. There were also larger political grounds on which Lincoln showed his skills as well. Displays that historians have often misinterpreted as mere political chicanery, or worse, as political cowardice. Above all, Lincoln had a very precise constitutional and political understanding of the Civil War and of its origins. As soon as the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter, in events where Lincoln's political shrewdness also paid off, Lincoln had a war he could justify as a war for the Union, a war that, unlike a war to abolish slavery, could win immediate mass support in the North. Yet Lincoln never relinquished the idea that were the Union restored, he would then still do all he could under the Constitution to restrict slavery's spread, and thereby hasten its downfall. In fighting for the Union, he was also fighting for the legitimacy of the outcome of the election of 1860, in which a political party sworn to begin the process of ending slavery had captured the White House for the first time, along with this was Lincoln at his political best. Naturally, Greeley and his supporters and other ministers and mayors thought that his responses were weak, milquetoast, terrible, woeful. But Lincoln was manipulated, and with a purpose. To sound as conservative as he could, while also giving himself grounds to take the very action which his critics were demanding. Seemingly a rebuke to the radicals, Lincoln was actually doing his best to shore up support among conservative and moderate Northerners. For unbeknownst to them, he had already discussed emancipation with his cabinet members and, in a matter of weeks in late September, would formally release a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation that would serve as the foundation for the final proclamation released on January 1st, 1863. Of course, that first step towards ending slavery would have come to nothing had Lincoln failed to win re-election in 1864. Something which has turned to emancipation for a time really seemed to endanger. But Lincoln, ever the man of principle, possessed more than a sufficient political skill to understand that danger, and finally, and with the added grace, as he would have put it, of Providence, as well as the Union Army, finally to ward it off.